My name is Sarah Turner, and I've always had a fascination with the abandoned and the forgotten. There's something about peeling paint and broken windows that calls to me, whispering stories of the past. It was this curiosity that led me to the old Willowbrook Asylum, a place long closed and shrouded in mystery. It was a chilly October afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned wing of Willowbrook. Michael, our unofficial leader, had heard rumors of the asylum's dark history. Emily, the skeptic of the group, scoffed at the idea of ghosts but joined for the thrill. Alex, ever the photographer, was eager to capture the eerie beauty of the decaying building. We arrived at the asylum just before sunset. The main building loomed ahead, its windows like dark, soulless eyes. The abandoned wing, where we were headed, was said to be the most haunted part of the complex. The rusted gate creaked open, and we slipped through, our footsteps crunching on the overgrown path. The door to the abandoned wing was ajar, hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. Broken furniture and scattered papers littered the floor. As we ventured deeper, the temperature seemed to drop, and an uneasy feeling settled over us. Michael led the way, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily muttered, sticking close to Alex. "Just think of the stories we'll have," Michael said with a grin, though his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. We passed through a series of rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. Old medical equipment lay rusting, and graffiti covered the walls. It was hard to imagine that this place had once been a bustling center for psychiatric care. As we entered what appeared to be a common room, Alex paused to take a photo. The flash illuminated the space, revealing an old, tattered couch and a crumbling fireplace. That's when we heard a soft, whispering voice, so faint it was almost inaudible. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Hear what?" Emily replied, looking around nervously. "It sounded like..." Whispering, Michael said, his eyes wide. We stood still, straining to hear. The whispering came again, slightly louder this time, but we couldn't make out the words. A cold breeze brushed past us, and the room seemed to darken. "Let's keep moving," Michael suggested, though his confidence seemed shaken. We made our way to the children's ward, a place rumored to be the most haunted area of the asylum. The hallway was lined with small, empty rooms. Faded murals of cartoon characters adorned the walls, adding a chilling contrast to the bleak surroundings. As we walked, Alex's camera flashed, capturing the eerie atmosphere. Suddenly, we heard the sound of footsteps, light and quick, like those of a child running. "Is someone there?" Michael called out, his voice echoing down the hall. There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the abandoned wing. We entered one of the rooms, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of sadness. It was as if the walls themselves were imbued with the sorrow of the children who had once lived there. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a small, dusty toy on the floor. It was a stuffed bear, its fur matted and eyes missing. She picked it up, and as she did, a chill ran down my spine. "I don't think we're alone," I whispered, and the others nodded in agreement. We continued exploring, but the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. It was as if the very air was thick with the weight of the past. In the main hall, we found a set of stairs leading to the basement. The door was locked, but Michael managed to pry it open with a crowbar. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Michael replied. "We might as well see what's down there." The basement was even colder and darker than the upper floors. Our flashlights barely penetrated the thick gloom. As we descended, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. We found ourselves in a large room filled with old medical records and broken equipment. In the corner, there was a small, barred cell. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. "This must have been where they kept the most disturbed patients," Michael said, peering inside. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. We all jumped, our flashlights shaking. "What the hell was that?" Alex exclaimed, his voice cracking with fear. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, backing away from the cell. As we turned to leave, the whispering grew louder, filling the room with an eerie chorus of voices. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, and the temperature plummeted. Then, out of the darkness, figures began to emerge. Pale, transparent shapes of men, women, and children, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and sorrow. They moved slowly, their eyes fixed on us. "We need to go. Now," I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her towards the stairs. The spirits reached out to us, their fingers brushing our skin, cold as ice. We stumbled up the stairs, the door at the top still closed. Michael pushed against it with all his strength, and finally it burst open. We ran through the hallways, the spirits following close behind. Their whispers grew into anguished cries, echoing off the walls. It felt like the asylum itself was alive, trying to keep us trapped within its decaying embrace. We burst through the front door and into the cold night air. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the spirits vanished as if they had never been there. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Michael replied, "but I think Jenkins was right. The spirits of the patients are still there, trapped in that place." We never went back to Willowbrook Asylum. The experience left us all shaken, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something that should have been left alone. Emily, ever the skeptic, was the most affected, refusing to talk about what happened that night. For me, the memory of the abandoned wing and its restless spirits remains a haunting reminder of the thin line between our world and the next. And every time I pass by the old asylum, I can still hear the faint whispering of the past, calling out from the shadows. My name is Daniel Reed, and I've always been drawn to stories that others shy away from. As an investigative journalist, I've uncovered scandals and exposed hidden truths. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found at Willowbrook Asylum. It all started with a tip from a source who wished to remain anonymous. They claimed that unethical experiments had been conducted at Willowbrook Asylum before it was shut down in the late 1970s. The asylum, notorious for its poor conditions, had a reputation that made it fertile ground for dark secrets. With my curiosity piqued, I packed my camera, recorder, and notebook and drove to the small town of Reddington, where the asylum stood, abandoned and decaying. I arrived on a cold, overcast afternoon, the sky a dull gray blanket that matched the somber atmosphere of the place. The townspeople were tight-lipped about Willowbrook, their eyes shadowed with a mix of fear and disgust. The asylum loomed ahead, a hulking structure of crumbling brick and shattered windows. It took a bit of effort, but I managed to pry open the rusted front door and step inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mold lingered in the hallways. I turned on my flashlight and began my exploration. I moved through room after room, each one a snapshot of decay. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and rusted medical equipment were strewn everywhere. As I ventured deeper, I found a staircase leading to the basement. My source had mentioned that the most damning evidence could be found there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the temperature dropping noticeably. The basement was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight, which cast long, eerie shadows on the damp walls. I found myself in a large room filled with old files and broken equipment. In the far corner, something caught my eye, a door slightly ajar, leading to what looked like a small office. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was cluttered with old books, medical journals, and a desk covered in dust. But what drew my attention was a large, leather-bound journal. I opened it, and my heart raced as I read the first few pages. It was a detailed account of experiments conducted by Dr. Harold Marlowe, the head psychiatrist at Willowbrook. The experiments, described in cold, clinical language, involved patients subjected to extreme and inhumane treatments. Electroshock therapy, chemical injections, sensory deprivation, all designed to push the human mind to its breaking point. As I read on, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The last few entries were the most disturbing. Dr. Marlowe wrote about an experiment where he attempted to merge the consciousness of multiple patients, believing he could create a superior mind. The results were catastrophic, resulting in the deaths of several patients. I decided to look for more evidence. I left the office and continued exploring the basement, eventually finding a series of rooms that looked like makeshift laboratories. One room in particular stood out. The door was heavy and reinforced, unlike the others. With some effort, I managed to force it open. Inside, the room was lined with metal tables and strange equipment. But what caught my attention were the restraints on the tables, rusted but still intact. The walls were covered in faded, yellowing photographs of patients, their expressions twisted in agony and fear. In the center of the room, there was a large metal cabinet. I opened it and found rows of jars filled with preserved organs, each one labeled with a patient number. The sight made my stomach churn, but I pressed on, driven by a morbid curiosity. As I photographed the room, I heard a faint noise behind me. I turned, my flashlight beam sweeping the room, but saw nothing. I shook off the feeling of unease and continued documenting the evidence. I moved to the next room, which appeared to be a holding area for patients. The walls were lined with small, barred cells, each one barely large enough to stand in. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I felt a growing sense of dread. As I explored, I started to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt as if the very walls were speaking to me, telling me to leave. I turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. My flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with the flashlight, finally managing to turn it back on. The room was empty, but the whispers continued, now a cacophony of tortured voices. I raced out of the holding area, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. I stumbled through the dark hallways, the beam of my flashlight bobbing wildly. I could feel a presence behind me, cold and malevolent, closing in. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst into the main hallway and made a beeline for the front door, wrenching it open and tumbling outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I kept running, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, finally managing to start the engine. I sped away from Willowbrook Asylum, the dark silhouette of the building receding in my rearview mirror. Back in my hotel room, I reviewed the photographs and recordings. The evidence was undeniable proof of the horrific experiments conducted at Willowbrook. But there was something else, something that chilled me to the bone. In several of the photographs, I could see faint, ghostly figures, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and despair. I wrote my article, exposing the dark history of Willowbrook Asylum. The story made headlines, and the asylum was sealed off for good, declared a historical site too dangerous to enter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the spirits of the patients were still with me, whispering their tormented stories in the dead of night. To this day, I still hear the whispers, a constant reminder of the horrors I uncovered, and every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, begging for justice, for peace. But most of all, they want to be remembered, their suffering not forgotten in the dark annals of history. My name is Dr. Emily Collins, and I never believed in the supernatural. As a medical professional, I've always placed my trust in science and logic. However, my recent transfer to St. Augustine's Asylum has tested those beliefs in ways I could never have imagined. I had just started my residency at St. Augustine's, a sprawling, Gothic structure on the outskirts of town. The asylum had been operational for over a century, its history rich with stories of groundbreaking psychiatric care and, inevitably, dark rumors. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, I wandered into the hospital's old library. Dust-covered shelves lined the walls, filled with medical texts and patient records. As I scanned the titles, a leather-bound journal caught my eye. It was tucked behind a row of books, its cover cracked and faded. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it. The first page was inscribed with elegant handwriting, Dr. Harold Armitage, 1922. Intrigued, I sat down at one of the library's ancient wooden tables and began to read. The journal detailed Dr. Armitage's day-to-day activities, but as I delved deeper, the entries took a darker turn. He described strange occurrences, patients claiming to see shadows that weren't there, objects moving on their own, and inexplicable cold spots throughout the building. I was skeptical but fascinated. That night, I brought the journal back to my apartment. As I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the eerie events Dr. Armitage had described. Finally, exhaustion overtook my curiosity, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, feeling an intense cold. My breath misted in the air, and I heard a faint whispering. At first, I thought it was a dream, but the cold was too real, too tangible. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw the journal lying on my bedside table. The whispering seemed to emanate from it, growing louder and more insistent. Frightened, I grabbed the journal and threw it into my closet, shutting the door tightly. The whispering ceased, and the room gradually warmed. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next day, I couldn't focus on my work. The journal haunted my thoughts, and I knew I had to read more. After my shift, I retrieved the journal and continued from where I had left off. Dr. Armitage's entries grew increasingly frantic. He wrote about patients disappearing from their rooms, only to reappear days later with no memory of where they had been. He also mentioned seeing a figure in black lurking in the hallways, always just out of sight. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to investigate the areas mentioned in the journal. Late at night, after the other staff had gone home, I roamed the asylum's empty halls. The old building creaked and groaned, every sound amplified in the silence. I started in the West Wing, where Dr. Armitage had reported most of the strange occurrences. The air was thick with dust, and my footsteps echoed loudly. As I walked, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath misted in front of me, just as it had in my apartment. I heard faint whispering, growing louder as I approached an old, wooden door at the end of the hall. The door was locked, but I remembered Dr. Armitage's entry about a hidden key in the library. I hurried back, searching through the shelves until I found a small, brass key taped inside a book cover. Returning to the door, I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open, and I pushed the door ajar. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of strange, preserved specimens. A large, oak desk stood in the center, covered in papers and medical instruments. But what drew my attention was a portrait on the wall, a stern-looking man in a lab coat. The plaque beneath read, "Dr. Harold Armitage." I shivered as I realized I was standing in his office. On the desk, I found more journals, each one filled with accounts of the asylum's patients and the paranormal activities he had witnessed. As I read, I heard the whispering again, louder this time, as if surrounding me. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold. The whispering turned into low, guttural growls. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure in black. It was tall and shadowy, its face obscured by darkness. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure moved towards me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I backed away, my mind racing for a way out. Remembering Dr. Armitage's last entry, I knew I had to confront the entity. He had written about a ritual to banish the spirits that haunted the asylum. With shaking hands, I grabbed a piece of chalk from the desk and drew a circle on the floor, just as the journal instructed. I stepped inside and began reciting the incantation written in the margins. The entity paused, seeming to waver. As I continued the ritual, the whispering grew louder, almost deafening. The entity writhed, its form flickering like a candle flame. I shouted the final words, and the entity let out a horrific scream, Dissolving into a cloud of black smoke, the whispering ceased, and the room warmed instantly. I collapsed to the floor, shaking with relief and exhaustion. The journals on the desk were still there, silent now. I knew that the entity was gone, but the asylum still held its secrets. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The asylum seemed lighter, less oppressive, but I knew the spirits of the past lingered still. I shared my findings with my colleagues, who were skeptical but intrigued. I kept Dr. Armitage's journal, a reminder of the horrors I had uncovered and the bravery it took to face them. The experience changed me, teaching me that not everything can be explained by science and logic. Some things are meant to remain mysteries, hidden in the shadows of places like St. Augustine's Asylum. And every time I walk the halls at night, I listen for the whispers, wondering if they will ever return. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.